Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our seminar tutorial Germanische Heilkunde by Dr. Germanische MD. Good evening to you. Our topic today, the common threads of Germanische Heilkunde. No one becomes a master overnight. And so it is with Germanische Heilkunde. It requires a certain amount of study. Therapists should learn Germanische Heilkunde, GHK, in university, and normal citizens can learn it in biology classes. The application of GHK is much more complex than the theory. You have to have enough empathy to be able to put yourself in the patient's shoes. This being able to empathize with the patient cannot be learned. One has this empathy, or one does not have it. The royal art of Germanische Heilkunde is to be the wise counsel to the patient, so that he can solve his own conflict. Unfortunately, wisdom cannot be learned either. Either you have it, or you don't. Not everyone is suitable to be a therapist. But not everyone has to become a therapist either. To be able to help oneself with Germanische Heilkunde, an average intellect is sufficient. Anyone who has the will can learn to understand the 5 biological laws of nature, discovered by Dr.Hamer. This brief introduction to Germanische Heilkunde is intended to serve this purpose. I would now like to show you, dear readers, the common threads in Germanische Heilkunde. From have to believe, it should become I know, and I am not afraid. What is Germanische Heilkunde all about? In a nutshell, we can say that it is about the cause of disease. Where do cancer, allergies, chronic diseases, and psychoses come from? And only the knowledge of the cause enables the therapy to be effective, and this is what we call causal therapy. Causal therapy is the only real therapy. It has no side effects and usually costs very little. But what exactly is the cause? The first biological law of nature, discovered by Dr.Hamer, is also called the iron rule of cancer and describes the cause of disease. The Dirk-Hamer Syndrome, DHS. All diseases that arise on their own, without being caused by accident or due to extreme malnutrition, are always monocausal. This means that the cause of the disease is 100% verifiable, the biological conflict shock. When the conflict shock happens, there is a specific area of the brain that is impacted, and in GHK we call this the Hamer's focus, HH. This impacted area in the brain immediately develops sharp-edged and concentric rings in the conflict active phase, that can be photographed in computer tomography and thus be proven. Dr. Hamer named this biological conflict shock after his deceased son, Dirk-Hamer Syndrome, DHS. Through his son's tragic death, Dr. Hamer observed this conflict shock on his own body for the first time. This DHS always has 3 criteria. First, the feeling is highly acute, dramatic. Second, the feeling of isolation. Third, the individual has been caught on the wrong foot, the shock is unexpected. Along with the biological conflict shock, there is an immediate sympathicotonic reaction, which stimulates the sympathetic nervous system, causing stress and cold hands. In GHK the word disease is not used for various reasons, which will not be explained here. Instead, we refer to sensible biological special programs, SBS. These SBS arise in order to help us solve a conflict shock moment causally. These SBSs do this in 3 different ways. First, by cell proliferation as in, colorectal cancer, liver cancer, lung cancer, breast cancer, melanoma. Second, by cell loss, as the ulcers of the squamous epithelium. Third, by loss of function, that is without cell plus or cell minus, as for example in diabetes or paralysis of skeletal muscles. These symptoms, which GHK refers to as conflict active symptoms, visibly increase with intensity and for the duration of the conflict. Thus, the longer the conflict lasts, the larger the tumor or cell atrophy becomes, and the more pronounced the loss of function becomes. If one were to merely fight the symptom in this conflict active phase, without resolving the conflictive cause, the symptom would recur. Our body does not react in this way due to any bad intentions from Mother Nature. Instead, it is Mother Nature's way of resolving this biological conflict shock. This is done through specific functional strengthening, or specific functional failure. Basically, the organ symptom is Mother Nature's specific therapy for the cause, and helps us to resolve this biological conflict. To understand the biological sense of each SBS, one must learn to understand the whole of medicine from its evolutionary history. So far we have learned. First, the biological conflict shock is also known as the DHS, Dirk-Hamer Syndrome. Second, this conflict shock causes a reaction which starts a SBS. Third, The symptoms of the SBS are called conflict-active symptoms. Ernst Haeckel formulated the sentence 100 years ago, ontogenesis is a recapitulation of phylogenesis. In other words, the development of the embryo in the womb is a recapitulation of the evolutionary development of a species, phylogenesis. So, from our moment of conception, fertilization of the ovum by the sperm, we have all gone through the complete process of becoming human, over several 100 million years, in our mother's womb in a time lapse of 9 months. If we look back now into embryonic development, we look back thus into the history of the development of humanity. With this, we can say that our ancestors must have been ring-shaped, worm-like creatures. Sea anemones still look like this today. Dr.Hamer sorted all organs according to the germ layers tissue types. With this, he was finally able to bring a coherent system to the many different diseases. The 3 colored differentiated columns represent the 3 germ layers. The left yellow column is the glandular tissue or endoderm. The middle orange column is the mesoderm, and is divided into the gland-like tissue and the connective tissue. The outer red column is the squamous epithelium or ectoderm, which includes the functional failures. In the case of a special program from the glandular tissue, the Hamer's focus is always on the brain stem. It can be stated that the brain stem correlates with the glandular tissue. In addition, the cerebellum correlates with the gland-like tissue, the cerebral medulla with the connective tissue, and the squamous epithelium correlate with the functional failures, controlled by the cerebral cortex. If we now look at the whole of medicine from the history of development, we not only understand the biological sense of the special program, but also what the person associated with, at the moment of the biological conflict shock. Our ancestors had a primeval mouth, through which they took in the food morsel and also excreted the waste morsel. Our ancestors lived in the primeval sea, and their purpose in life was to eat and reproduce. Their organs were from the glandular tissue, and their brain was the brain stem. Their conflict potential was the food morsel. If they were too slow to catch the food morsel, the Hamer focus would appear in the brain stem, in the relay for the thyroid gland. The thyroid gland would then initiate a cell proliferation and a function amplification, according to the 3rd biological law of nature. More thyroid hormones are produced, and thus a thyroid hyperfunction would be present, Graves' disease. Our ancestors became faster in real terms, and could thus solve the cause one was too slow. However, when our ancestors caught the morsel, then the cell division of the thyroid gland stopped, and the no longer needed cell plus were broken down in the healing phase by the associated microbes, the fungi, and fungal bacteria, tuberculously. Suppose the little animal, our ancestor, swallows a morsel, which now lies however crosswise and undigested in the intestine. In this case, the Hamer focus is likewise in the brain stem, in the relay for the intestinal villi cells. A little bit mouth where the intestinal villi multiply, and a cauliflower-like intestinal cancer develops, which produces liters of digestive juices, in order to digest this stuck morsel still. If this morsel finally slips through, the cell division of the intestinal villi stops. In the healing phase, the intestinal cancer, which is now no longer needed, is broken down tuberculously by the fungi and fungal bacteria. What we have to understand is that Mother Nature associates. For the little animal, it is usually about the real food morsel. For us humans today, this morsel can also be about money or a house, which one would like to take and cannot, or the indigestible trouble with the mother-in-law, which lies in one's stomach. So in the case of glandular tissue, we always have cell proliferation in the active phase, and thus an increase in function. Therefore the biological sense is immediately in the conflict-active phase. By an increase in digestive juices, to better digest or better absorb the morsel. Or by an increase in mucus, so that the morsel slips in or out better. If you now only cut away the colon cancer but do not solve the morsel conflict, then colon cancer symptoms return. Mother Nature wants to solve the cause with this. The paradigm shift in medicine is now. What must the therapy focus on? On the symptom, as before? Or on the cause? Of course, we have to address the cause, because it is the conflict. In the healing phase, we always have a tuberculous. A necrotizing degradation in the glandular tissue due to the fungi and fungal bacteria. Similar to an apple that rots and decays. We have inherited everything from our ancestors, their digestive system and their brain. The brain stem is the oldest part of our brain. Our ancestors left the sea and conquered the land, thus they needed additional organs. The inner skins to protect themselves against sharp stones. An additional control unit for these additional organs was needed, and so the cerebellum had to be added. The biological sense for this organ dermis is to create a wall for defense against the outside, to protect from physical attack. The associated conflict content here is violation of integrity, such as an attack, disfigurement, or defilement conflicts. For example, if you spit in someone's face, he may feel defiled where the spit touched his face. The Hamer focus is in the cerebellum, in the relay for the dermis. According to the third biological law of nature, from now on the dermis induces cell proliferation. It is making the wall to the outside thicker. A melanoma develops, which becomes larger and larger, until the person can solve this defilement. The melanoma is therefore the biological sense, sensible biological special programs, SBS. Once this defilement conflict has been solved, the melanoma stops growing and is decomposed in the healing phase by the responsible microbes, fungus, bacteria, and tuberculous. The melanoma begins to bleed and ooze. It also begins to stink, as any tuberculous in the healing phase, it stinks of rotten flesh. At the end of the healing phase the melanoma is gone, and no longer diagnosable by conventional medicine. Mother Nature programmed into the cerebellum of our ancestors the first social behavior. The mammary glands are developmentally transformed sweat glands of the dermis, which is why we also find the mama ca, intraductal mama carcinoma, in the cerebellum. If a mother has an accident with her child, and associates a conflict with regard to the care of her child, she will have the Hamer focus in the cerebellum. She reacts from now on with an increase in the mammary gland cells, a so-called mama ca. The biological sense of this is to produce more breast milk in the conflict active phase, through cell proliferation, to give the injured child a higher chance of survival. If this child becomes healthy, this additional breast milk is no longer necessary, and the cell division of the mammary gland stops. In the healing phase, the inactive mammary ca, like melanoma, is tuberculously degraded by the fungal bacteria. In each tuberculous healing phase, night sweats are also present. Our ancestors needed a locomotor system with bones, muscles, tendons, cartilage, and so on. The cerebral medulla was grown for these additional organs. The cerebral medulla is the seat of self-esteem. A person with healthy self-esteem has an upright gait. Someone who has collapsed in self-value has problems with his musculoskeletal system such as scoliosis, ankylosing spondylitis, lumbago, bone cancer, anemia, leukemia, and so on. Attention, with the cerebral medulla we are now in the cerebrum, and according to the third biological law of nature, in the conflict active phase there is cell loss instead of a cell proliferation. This cell loss is called necrosis in connective tissue, and osteolysis in bone. In nature, if you can't solve a self-value collapse, these holes get bigger and bigger until the bone breaks, or the tendon snaps. In nature one would be the prey of animal predators. So here, Mother Nature does not help right away. In these programs we must first resolve the conflict. Then in the healing phase, thanks to the responsible microbes, the bacteria, these holes are filled up again through the swelling. At the end of the healing phase, the swelling goes down again. But the bone and tendon remain thicker than they were before. Like the healed bone fracture, the former fracture site also remains strengthened. A thicker bone is better than a thinner one. This functional reinforcement in connective tissue is permanent. For this reason, Dr.Hamer also called this connective tissue group deluxe group. Here Mother Nature does not help immediately, but only at the end of healing, but then for a lifetime. The social togetherness. Our youngest brain is the cerebral cortex. It is also the most complex brain. Here the social togetherness is coordinated, and it is about separation conflicts and territorial area conflicts. The cerebral cortex controls the squamous epithelium and the functional failures. The separation conflicts. In nature, when the young are separated from the mother, it is certain death for the young. Dear mother, you will never see your young again. Forget it. The mother will have impaired short-term memory during a separation conflicts active phase. Alzheimer's is multiple or severe separation conflicts. The mother's outer skin will ulcerate at the place where she associates the most tactile connection with her child. The skin begins to flake and becomes rough. Now the subject of dry neurodermatitis is present. You can imagine it as if a glued joint is torn open. This does not hurt, because it is accompanied by sensory paralysis of the outer skin. This place is sensory numb. This numbness of the skin, along with her impaired short-term memory, helps the mother more easily to forget her child, so that she can go on with her life. Mother Nature is merciful. If contrary to expectations, the child finds its way back to the mother, This mother no longer accepts her child. She has forgotten it. If the mother can resolve her separation conflict, the ulcers of the outer skin are replenished with swelling and inflammation. However, this healing phase of the squamous epithelium proceeds without microbes, because viruses certainly do not exist. So, the skin reddens, it is hot, itchy, and painful. Now, dermatologists speak of skin deterioration, which is actually a healing phase. Such resolved separation conflicts include eczema, blooming neurodermatitis, hives, etc. The territorial area conflict. Mother Nature creates the biologically natural hierarchy, the alpha wolf and the sub-wolf, through territorial area conflicts. In nature only the strongest may pass on his genes. In nature, the single wolf cannot survive. It must organize itself in the pack to be able to hunt successfully. In order for the pack to function, it needs a structure of command. The classic territorial fight. The stronger defeats the weaker. The weaker one has now lost his territory. He has his Hamer's focus in the territorial area, more precisely in the cerebral relay of the coronary arteries. In this loss of territory conflict, the squamous epithelium of the coronary arteries ulcerates, increasing their lumen, cross-section, and allowing more blood to reach the heart muscle. The heart becomes stronger. So, the sense of this special program is again in the active phase, in order to achieve functional strengthening by cellular atrophy. Should the inferior in this territorial fight, despite this special program and the strengthened heart in the performance, still not manage to recapture his territory, he resigns. He gives up and subordinates himself. Thus he can transform the conflict intensity down, and he can grow old with it without dying of emaciation. He has come to terms with his conflict and resigned himself to it. Thus, he remains in a so-called hanging active conflict process and continuously builds up conflict load. However, with his resignation, his male territorial side closes itself, whereby he becomes female and homosexual. For humans, such a resignation occurs after approximately 6 months. With more than 9 months of conflict load, it is best not to solve this territorial conflict, because we could not survive the crisis, the classical heart attack. With regard to myocardial infarction, it should be added that it is not the blocked coronary vessel in the healing phase that is to blame, as conventional medicine erroneously assumes. Rather the fact that during the crisis no more signals are sent from the brain relay to the heart muscle, causing the heart to stop beating. The heart attack is, therefore, purely a brain symptom. Bypass surgery is not a causative therapy, it does not treat the cause. In an actual occlusion, the coronary vessels themselves form regular bypass tangles of blood vessels in a short time. A program of nature that would be impossible had the subordinate wolf died of the occlusion. Now, when the female ovulates in nature, the alpha is present. The second wolf has no desire because, by the active Hamer focus in the relay for the coronary arteries, his libido is almost non-existent. Thus, the female always has her children from the strongest, the alpha. Functional failures. Finally, I briefly would like to introduce you to the very interesting functional failures. They are all controlled by the cerebral cortex. Their conflict active phase is the functional failure, such as the loss of sense of smell. Functional failures do not make cell proliferation or cell loss, which is why there can never be inflammation here in the healing phase. The loss of function is about nerves. And nerves no longer divide after birth. The biological sense of these function failures happens immediately in the conflict active phase. Once again, Mother Nature immediately helps with a functional failure with a motor conflict related to not being able to escape, and induces paralysis of the leg musculature. And this is nothing else than the well-known play dead reflex. What does the rabbit do, which cannot escape anymore? Correct. It plays dead. Finally, I would like to speak about the biological order of the different special programs. At the moment of the conflict shock, associations are made. An involuntary association of thoughts takes place, what we call the conflict content. This conflict content determines the localization of the Hamer focus in the brain, and thereby the organ symptom. This can occur in a fetus, an infant, an adult, and even in an animal. This conflict shock is the cause of the organ disease and must be understood in its entirety, in order to derive a causal therapy from it. Second biological law of nature. The second biological law of nature discovered by Dr.Hamer describes the two-phase nature of all sensible biological special programs, provided that the conflict can be resolved. With the conflict, cancer develops. With the conflict resolution, cancer stops. The conflict resolution brings to an end the cell proliferation, it stops the cell shrinkage, and it stops the loss of function. This principle is easy to understand for everyone, and scientifically easy to prove. If the conflict cannot be resolved, the SBS remains single phase, with all the consequences. The patient continuously builds up conflict load. The cell plus and the cell minus become larger and larger. The loss of function takes on ever-increasing dimensions. The patient remains under permanent stress, emaciates, and wears out. Conflict resolution initiates the healing phase. With conflict resolution, the famous weight falls from the patient's soul. The vegetative nervous system immediately switches from sympathetic atonia to vagatonia. The patient immediately gets warm hands, can sleep again, is relieved, and has an appetite again. Each healing phase takes place under edema storage in the brain, and on the organ level. In the brain, the sharp rings of the Hamer focus are now lost, and the brain relay now turns dark in the computed tomography, CT, due to this edema deposit. So, we can also see in the computed tomography whether the conflict is still active, or has already been resolved. This edema storage is a space-occupying process and now causes corresponding brain symptoms, such as nausea and headaches. At the organ level, the edema storage also causes swelling and associated pain. How do you solve conflicts? People are so very different, as are their conflicts, and thus conflict solutions are always individual. There can be no one-fits-all solution. As a rule, we solve our conflicts instinctively due to the compulsive thinking that the biological conflict shock has given us. All thoughts immediately circle around the problem. Patients dream of their unresolved conflicts at night. Basically, the entire organism is oriented towards conflict resolution. We do not rest until a solution to this problem comes to our mind, such as getting divorced and starting a new life. Sometimes our conflicts are solved by chance. Unexpectedly lightning strikes the mother-in-law, and suddenly the world looks completely different. With the knowledge of these biological connections, we can precisely find the biological conflict and derive a patient-specific therapy from this conflict. The core of this therapy is that the weight on the patient's soul is removed. The patient can be helped with a wise counsel to find his conflict, and then the cancer stops without us having treated the patient in the conventional sense. This wise counsel is, as has been stated, the royal art in the Germanische Heilkunde. The healing phase with its specific symptoms begins with the resolution of the conflict. These healing phases are vagatonic and are often accompanied by a fever. In such a healing phase the patient is weak and tired. The patient has to recover from the strenuous conflict active phase, where he used up his energy reserves. Healing phases are accompanied by inflammation of the tissue. The previously formed tumors are tuberculously degraded, and the preceding necroses are replenished with swelling. In general, the conflict active phase is less frequent than the healing phase. In the healing phase, the patient thinks he is sick. The healing phase lasts about as long as the conflict active phase. In the middle of the healing phase, always the epicrisis occur, which we will look at in a little more detail later. Fourth biological law of nature. The ontogenetic developmental system of microbes. A surgeon cannot remove prostate carcinoma without damaging the nerves, resulting in permanent incontinence and impotence. Microbes, on the other hand, can tuberculously degrade an inactive prostate carcinoma without damaging the nerves, and as a result the patient is neither incontinent nor impotent. Microbes are the best surgeons. All microbes strictly adhere to tissue boundaries, and would never attack another germ layer. Thus, the nerve fibers remain unaffected in a biological healing phase with tuberculosis. All microbes work only in a vagatonic healing phase. In the previous conflict active phase, tumors developed in the old brain-controlled organs, which help resolve the triggering conflict by cell proliferation and functional enhancement. The conflict is resolved in the healing phase, and the tumor becomes unnecessary. There is no more cell division and the tumor is inactive. With the resolution of the conflict, the microbes now receive the command from the brain to begin their work as surgeons, and to break down the tumor, which has become superfluous, in a tuberculous, caseous, necrotizing manner. The tumor decays similarly to the way in which an apple rots. Thus, in these old brain-controlled healing phases tuberculous degradation always occurs, and a typical symptom is night sweats. There are two reasons why we should rejoice at night sweats. First, the conflict has been resolved. Second, there are microbes in the brainstem-controlled glandular tissue, and fungi and the fungal bacteria as the associated microbes in the healing phase. The fungal bacteria are also called mycobacteria. In the cerebellar glandular tissue, the associated microbes are the fungal bacteria. Fungi and fungal bacteria thus break down unnecessary tissue. In the case of the cerebral medulla-controlled connective tissue, the associated microbes are the bacteria. The bacteria help to replenish the necroses and osteolysis of the previous conflict-active phase. The ulcers in the squamous epithelium are also refilled with swelling and inflammation, but without microbes. Viruses do not exist at all. Microbes are not the cause of a healing phase symptom, but rather they always work during a healing phase. This means that there is no such thing as an infection. Let us assume that Dr. Hamer is right in his assertions that the evil in our body does not exist at all, that the infection does not exist at all, that the carcinogenic substances do not exist at all. Wouldn't that be liberating? We would lose these unfounded fears, and could march through life with relief. We could recognize this current corona hype for what it is, namely the biggest deprivation of freedom from the world population, and the installation of a global hierarchical world dictatorship, thus the enslavement of humanity. Maybe this is also why Dr. Hamer has been fought and hushed up by the deep state for 4 decades. The crisis in the middle of the healing phase. The patient visibly falls into deep vagatonia with the resolution of the conflict. The vessels change from narrow to wide, and he gets warm hands and a fever. In the brain and on the organ level, edema is deposited in the involved areas. The patient is in the so-called exudative phase. This edema storage causes swelling, which causes various symptoms, such as intracranial pressure and pain. The patient feels visibly sicker. And to stop this falling into vagatonia, Mother Nature has built in the crises. The crises are similar depending on the germ layer. Actually, crises are brain symptoms. There are the brainstem crises, cerebellum crises, cerebral medulla crises, and the cerebral cortex crises. All crises are sympathicotonic with constriction of vessels, cold extremities, and cold sweat. The patient in the crisis is freezing and feels cold. Depending on the load of conflict, this crisis can be a second spike and may not always be noticed. However, it can last for several days with pre, main, and post-crises. The imposing crises are in the cerebral cortex. In addition to the symptoms already described here, we have absence, brief incommunicability and unresponsiveness, migraines, hepatic coma, pulmonary embolism, myocardial infarction or epileptic seizure, and so on. All patients experience the crisis. The critical point, especially with large loads of conflict, is always after the crisis. The task of the crisis is to steer the patient back towards health, and therefore the suppression of a sympathicotonic crisis with vagatonic substances must be avoided. On the contrary, the crisis must be strengthened, for example with coffee. If the crisis is too weak, or the conflict load is too big, the patient will die after the crisis. If the crisis is strong enough, the patient will find a way back to eutonia, health, after the crisis. At this point the doctors declare that the patient is now out of danger and that the crisis was the critical stage. During the conflict resolution, the patient gets worse and worse due to edema retention. In the crisis the patients think that their body is going crazy, or that they will die. With the onset of the crisis, the edema is squeezed out, and the patient has a urinary flood phase. He has to go to the toilet remarkably often. After the crisis, the brain relay and the organ begin to scar. Now the patient is in the scarring restitutive phase. From now on things get better and better. At the end of the healing phase, the patient is almost like new. The microbes have degraded the tumors, and the holes have been refilled. The functional deficits have disappeared. Only scars remain in the brain and at the organ level, but they usually are not bothersome. The patient is completely healthy again. This disappearance of cancer and regaining of health is called spontaneous healing. As is known, spontaneous healing has no side effects and costs hardly any money. In Germanische Heilkunde, spontaneous healing is the declared goal. The individual can heal himself only by eliminating the cause. A small example of a crisis you may have experienced yourself. After a resolved territorial annoyance concerning the squamous epithelium of the small curvature of the stomach pain is immediately gone, but you feel nauseous. This nausea culminates in the crisis, namely in an absence, squamous epithelium, and an epileptic seizure of the striated muscular components of the small curvature of the stomach. One has to vomit, is centralized and feels ice cold. Thereafter one falls back into vagatonia. One gets warm hands again, and nausea dissipates. So, this vomiting was a crisis. What has been described so far is one task of the crisis, to steer the patient in the direction of health. The other task of the crisis is, to highlight the time taken to solve the conflict. If you have taken too long, you will die shortly after the crisis. I would like to explain this drastic selection of Mother Nature based on the heart attack. Let us consider the territorial fight of deer. The weaker deer is driven away by the stronger one. The weaker one thereby suffers a loss of territory conflict. It cannot solve this conflict, it remains conflict active, and it builds up a visible conflict load. If a wolf now tears the top deer, the so far inferior deer thinks, that is quite favorable. I can take over the herd again. With this he also solves his loss of territory conflict, and he gets into the healing phase, and the crisis. Now Mother Nature checks the conflict load built up so far. If this has exceeded a critical limit, with us humans it would be 9 months for the loss of territory conflict, an empirical value. Mother Nature says, you have needed too long for this. You are not the best to get back the right for your reproduction. And before you continue to cause trouble in the pack, I will let you die. So similarly we must imagine the selection of Mother Nature. Now there is also the erroneous conflict resolution. Let's assume that the employee suffered a loss of territory conflict in the company, due to his demotion. He is conflict active and emaciated. After 6 months he comes to terms with the situation by saying to himself, I'll put in the extra years before I retire. I certainly won't make any more effort for this stupid company. Thereby he can transform his conflict down, and he could become ancient as a second wolf. Angina pectoris also subsides. Now with retirement, a new life begins for this former employee. The problems in the company belong to the past, and now he can finally devote himself to his hobby, his bird aviary. There he can appoint himself president, and soon governor general. Now this freshly retired man suddenly has his territory back. He solves his loss of territory, which was active for well over 9 months, and about 6 weeks after retirement, he dies of a heart attack. Our Minister of Social Affairs would call this event a socially acceptable early death. Erroneous was this conflict solution, because retirement does not exist at all in nature. In the natural pack, this fellow worker or this second wolf would have remained forever and could have become old with it. In Germanische Heilkunde we could have advised this employee already after the conflict, watch out with the pension. Better not get that pension. Stay in the company, for instance as a night porter, maybe even without pay, so that you get annoyed every day anew, and thus don't solve this territorial loss conflict. You get nothing out of retirement. This example should show that it is not always about conflict resolution. Often the therapy is called, so that the affected person can survive it, remain conflict active. The common threads. If we now arrange the so-called diseases according to the germ layers, we recognize the biological order of Mother Nature. One can almost say, Mother Nature explains to us how we have to live so that we do not become ill. She forces us biologically, but helps us immediately in need. The intestine is about the annoyance, the indigestible morsel. The thyroid gland with its over and under function is also about the morsel. One was too slow to get the good morsel, right lobe. Or too slow to get rid of the bad morsel of feces, left lobe. The liver parenchyma, liver cancer, is about the starvation conflict in a real sense. With the lung alveoli it is about the morsel of air, with the fear of death. The pancreas is the fight for the morsel, which is often inheritance conflicts. The middle ear is about the hearing morsel, with the primal eye with the choroidal melanoma about the light morsel, and so on. All these organs originate from the glandular tissue. All these special programs have a morsel conflict as the cause. All have their brain relay in the brain stem. All have cell proliferation in the conflict active and tubercular degradation in the healing phase. All have their biological sense immediately in the conflict active phase, through a functional amplification that immediately helps to solve this morsel. Their crises are rather inconspicuous, except for cold extremities. In their healing phases, we find fungi and mycobacteria. In none of these programs does handedness have significance. It is a question of whether the morsel cannot be eliminated or cannot be absorbed. Let's look at the connective tissue. All these connective tissue special programs are always about a self-value collapse. It is always the handedness that is decisive. The Hamer's focus is always in the cerebral medulla. The connective tissue necrotizes in the active phase. In cartilage this is called arthrosis, or wear and tear. In the healing phase these necroses are replenished with the help of bacteria, swelling, and inflammation. In cartilage this healing phase is called arthritis. The crises are hardly noticeable here, except for this cold centralization. But these healing phases have within them quite severe diagnoses, like lymph node cancer, bone cancer, leukemia, borreliosis, etc. An example of lymph node cancer. If we now have a patient in front of us with lymph node cancer under his right armpit, then we let him clap his hands beforehand. If he claps on the right side, we know this person has solved a self-devaluation conflict with a partner. We can now effectively explore his self-devaluation conflict, DHS, and the corresponding solution, CL, with the patient. He must have solved this self-value collapse, otherwise he would not have lymph node swelling. The therapist would congratulate the patient on his managed conflict resolution, and the patient would be happy. The conventional medical diagnosis would cause the patient an iatrogenic follow-up conflict. You have Hodgkin's disease, and if you don't get therapy, you will die. This lymph node swelling would subside at the end of the healing phase. The lymph node can remain palpably enlarged for life. And that is the biological purpose of the deluxe group, at the end of the healing phase. A thicker lymph node is better than a thinner one. Let us consider the squamous epithelium. In the same way one could sum up, and thus also understand the always the same progressions in the squamous epithelium, with its separation and territory conflicts. In the active phase, the squamous epithelium ulcerates and is replenished without microbes in the healing phase, under the swelling. The Hamer's focus is always in the cerebral cortex and the squamous epithelial special programs. The crises proceed with constriction of the vessels, and additionally with an absence. The handedness is crucial. The biological sense is in the active phase by loss of function, sensory paralysis, or ulcerative dilation of any hollow organs. Mother Nature can do everything. She can achieve a functional enhancement through cell plus, but she can also achieve this with a cell minus. And sometimes she achieves the biological sense even through a functional failure, as in the case of the play-dead reflex. If one has found these common threads in the Germanische Heilkunde, one can interpret the organ level. The better the therapist can deduce the many different symptoms from the scientific diagnostic chart, the more precise his questions are directed to the patient. The therapist knows exactly what to look for. If one knows the organ symptom and thus the tissue, one also knows which conflict to look for. One knows whether the organ symptom is to be assigned to the active or the healing phase. As such, one knows whether the conflict is still active or has already been resolved. A corresponding event must be detected in the patient on the level of his psyche. One knows when this conflict must have happened or been resolved shortly before the first organ symptom. If one knows the handedness, one also knows whether this conflict must be with a partner or the mother-child. If the patient is just in the healing phase and has found the conflict and the solution for this conflict, then one can estimate the conflict load, and thus one knows how long this healing phase will last, and when and which crisis must take place. So one can take a look into the future. Just as one can predict the date of birth of a pregnant woman. It is really fascinating. And I promise you, if one day you could verify these biological regularities for any patient case for the first time, you will be shocked. You will have an aha moment. The 5 biological laws of nature. The 5 biological laws of nature discovered by Dr.Hamer are laws in the living. They explain the biological connections of all special programs in living individuals. They are special programs, which Mother Nature gave to her own creatures on their way of life. As if Mother Nature had known from experience that such a fright moment would happen to her children. One can call this a history of development in which Mother Nature has optimally developed her creatures. The first biological law of nature. None of these conflictive experiences was wanted or self-induced by the individual. Always it caught the individual unprepared and on the wrong foot. Always the individual was left on his own, or felt isolated. It was highly acute dramatic for the individual, so that often years later he can still remember very well this moment of shock. The brain stores this moment of fright like a photograph. The association was an involuntary thought assignment. This happens with us humans and analogously also with the animal, according to this biological language. As a non-separable individual, the 3 levels of the psyche-brain organ always run absolutely synchronously. One must actually imagine this Hamer's compass for each level of the psyche-brain organ individually and synchronously running. If one is attentive, one can often notice the organ reaction immediately after the DHS, or immediately after the conflictolysis. The second biological law of nature. If the first biological natural law describes the cause, then the second biological natural law describes the solution. These first 2 laws of nature discovered by Dr.Hamer are also the most important. The other three laws of nature are more descriptive in nature. Thus, one moves from the first sympathicotonic conflict active phase to the second vagatonic healing phase only with the help of conflict resolution. If we cannot solve this conflict, then the first sympathicotonic stress phase remains. Attention, there can be no alternative to natural laws. The third biological law of nature. With the biological conflict shock, the DHS, a special program now starts, which helps us from a biological point of view to solve this conflict in order to find back to normatony, health. The special programs controlled from the brainstem and cerebellum make cell proliferation in the conflict active phase. The brainstem and the cerebellum together are called the old brain. The special programs controlled by the cerebral medulla and the cerebral cortex make cell atrophy in the conflict active phase. The cerebral medulla and the cerebral cortex together are called the cerebrum or new brain. From the cerebral cortex, the functional failures are also controlled, which makes neither cell loss nor cell proliferation. Fourth biological law of nature. The fourth biological law of nature, the ontogenetic, that is, developmental system of microbes, explains microbes as healing phase optimizers and surgeons of Mother Nature. Fungi and fungal bacteria tuberculously degrade the old brain tumors. The bacteria replenish the necroses in the connective tissue. In the squamous epithelium the ulcers are also refilled with swelling, but without microbes. The viruses do not exist. Microbes cause no contagion or infection. These are the healing phases. The fifth biological law of nature. With this fifth biological law of nature, the patient also understands that the symptom in his body is not the real problem. Why should he also be afraid of an event that helps him to solve the cause of his problem? If he understands that the real problem is with his company, or somewhere else, he will act causally on his own, and actively eliminate the cause of his cancer. Furthermore, he will lose the utterly unfounded fear that something foreign is raging in his body, and supposedly wants to eat him up. With the understanding of this fifth biological law of nature, one loses the fear of the symptom. Germanische Heilkunde makes the patient the boss of his very personal matter, and thus free. If I may give you one more piece of advice before leaving you here, make Germanische Heilkunde your hobby. The study is admittedly a bit tedious, but you can help yourself tremendously. Ladies and gentlemen, that completes my content for this topic. I would be pleased to welcome you again to the next seminar video of Germanische Heilkunde. Until then, I wish you a wonderful time.